That's the difference between you and me. You talk about it, I do it.
Sit down, Marks.
Let me talk to you. Acknowledge me.
Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to another DB's Territory Treasures. I am your host, DB. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. I want to thank you guys for supporting the Sit Down Marks podcast. Let's do a little housekeeping before we get moving here today. Make sure you go and check out our SummerSlam review. It is out right now. We just dropped that last week, so make sure you go check that out on all those podcast platforms, or you can check out the video over on sitdownmarks.com, and stay tuned for a brand new Dreamwave Prelude. We got volume 13 coming here pretty soon in just about another week. So by the time you hear this, in about another week, that thing will be live on sitdownmarks.com. So go check out Dreamwave Prelude, where we showcase the stars of tomorrow in Dreamwave Wrestling. I want to thank you guys for tuning in today. It's another round of DB's Territory Treasures. I'm still having so much fun doing this one. I want to thank you guys for supporting me. If you see me at a show, and you know, a lot of people have been coming to and tell me about how they like the episodes that I've come out with, you know, anywhere from Andre the Giant in the beginning to some of the ones that I've put out here lately with Magnum TA and Nikita Koloff and others. So make sure you guys check that out, and I really do appreciate all the support. But today in DB's Territory Treasures, this one features a look back into one of the most beloved talent enhancements wrestlers from the 80s and 90s. Today, I get to teach you about George South. Number one, George South, if you saw him here lately. But, you know, let me just give you a little let's just jump back into those days, right? So, you know, the 80s and 90s, the name jobbers, you know, it was derogatory for quite a while. You know, it still kind of is. You know, that's what the guys who were, you know, constantly getting their butts kicked by the you know, bigger, more popular wrestlers, you know, that's what they were called, or by the heel stars. You know, that's what they were called to be. The jobbers, you know, but talent enhancement is kind of talent enhancers, or you know, more like the name that we want to use, you know. But after a while, you know, we just begin to recognize them as just like our favorite wrestlers, you know, and we start to sympathize with them, you know, as they draw you in, because you see them get beat up a lot. You see them, you know, get beat up on a lot. You know, they get beat up by the big fancy heel, or the big nasty heels. They get beat up by the big fancy baby faces. So, you know, they would lose a lot, you know, and they would get the crap beat out of them a lot. So today, let's talk about Mr. George South. So in my childhood, you know, one of these, you know, the guys that fit the very description that I just explained to you, you know, was a guy named George South. You know, the territory was Jim Crockett Promotions in the 1980s. You know, my favorite territory, my favorite time, you know, of wrestling. You know, George was in the ring with just about everyone, it seemed, you know, heel or face. You know, George was the talent enhancement of that era and promotion, you know, alongside guys like Rocky King, you know, Gene Lagone, you know, those kind of guys. But, you know, George got over, I think, by being a great bumper. You know, he made his opponent look great. You know, he always did his job. You know, I just remember all the hard bumps he took, you know, from a lot of the, you know, Road Warriors and the Barbarians and those guys, just, you know, tossing these guys across the ring and stuff, you know, is pretty wild. But you know, he was the lovable loser, you know, opposite the Mulkey brothers, who were the lovable loser tag teams. You know, George South and Rocky King held those roles as singles. You know, they were like the top two, if you ask me. Most recognizable, I would say, you know, top two. But George's outfits, you know, there were nothing more than a jacket, really, usually a headband, maybe. He wore a mullet, you know, sometimes, but, you know, he's not supposed to really do more than that. You know, he's just supposed to be talent enhancement. You know, he did his job. Something, you know, wear some plain tights and some plain boots, you know, the heels would be more brutal wrestling him, it seems like, along the way, and it looks like he bumped harder, for those. So I guess kind of, why it seemed, a little more nasty when he was wrestling the bad guys, you know what I mean? But, and he had a mustache. The mustache is probably what made you recognize him the most. He had a mustache that helped me recognize him, a pure 80s mustache, because a lot of the guys had mustaches back then. He had that Southern Heritage kind of looking trunks, with stars on them, which kind of like exemplified the 80s. But, for sure, without a doubt, if you ever turned on TBS Superstation 605, 1000%, you saw George South wrestle, putting over talent there. George South, as far as I know, as far as I can find out, as far as the internets would tell me, that was his shoot name. Born September 7th, 1962 in Charlotte, North Carolina. Woo! Debuted in 1982, billed at 6'2", 235 pounds. He worked at FCW, Mid-South, prior to being on his way to Jim Crockett Promotions. But he debuted there for Jim Crockett Promotions at their very first TBS show. And I double-checked because I believe that was with Great Muta, and it was. And then he got Magnum TA the next week, and then he got a non-title match versus Flair just a couple weeks after that. So his reputation to work was quickly known and appreciated. He was, 605, first couple TBS shows, if they throw you on TV, that means they got a little bit of confidence in you. So they had a little bit of confidence in George as well. Flair had a lot of confidence. Ric Flair, he requested to work with George a lot, as he was, he would get sympathy from the crowd. George South was good at good at George getting heel heat on him, or good at Rick getting heel heat on George, so it worked out good because everybody was sympathetic with George, In 1988, he had a series of matches with Muta, early 90s. He would wrestle an up-and-coming Buff Bagwell, Alex Wright, and Johnny B. Bad, just to go to show you some of the guys that he wrestled that were on their way up. It seems like every NWA, WCW superstar, George had a match with him at some point, putting them over. But after WCW, George was on the independent scene for a little while, and still continues to do so, I believe, at 63 years old, around the Carolinas some. But he was a great heel in the independents. He was so good, at it, which kind of surprised me because, he was such a baby face, talent enhancement, and then saw him wrestle in the independents, and saw how he was talking to the fans, saw how he was, just being a character, being a guy that, could put on a performance, I guess, and have you involved, a showman. There you go. That's the word I was looking for. I was trying to pull it out, such a showman, more than I expected, really, but yeah, he was pretty good at being a heel. I was surprised at it, but he got pretty popular on the North Carolina, South Carolina indies, in the last 20 years. He's always been very popular in North Carolina, South Carolina anyway, because of being on WCW, and that kind of stuff in those days when, it was kind of like their heyday when, the Road Warriors were coming through, the Rock and Roll Express, all those guys. But, I'm glad George is still going, and being, he's a really good ambassador for pro wrestling. He's kind of like a link that's still alive to the old days, and just, really glad to see that he's still doing good on the independent scene. His wrestling opponent list has to be the who's who of wrestling. Guys and girls, I think, would kill for the list that, Greg probably has. I mean, I literally think he has wrestled everybody up until probably 2020, probably, maybe, or something like that. But, George, to me, man, like when I still wrestle, he's kind of like a time capsule of, what the business once was. I'm glad he still spreads his knowledge. Imagine the stories he has. Stories he has. Imagine that. Like, from those days, like it would be just amazing to sit down and talk to him. I'd love to have him on the podcast sometime and just pick his brain and talking to him about those old days, like house shows I went to. So many house shows. Like me and my dad went to so many house shows of WCW growing up, because they were always around. We couldn't really afford to go to the big Great American Bashes and, all those pay-per-views and stuff, Starcade, you know what I mean? So we always went to the house shows. George South was always on those house shows, sometimes twice, you know what I mean? So, but, the business is better because of guys like George. He's gritty. He's a tough guy, and I appreciate all that he's contributed. The era he came up in was really tough, man. He had a lot of hard bumps back then. Go look up some WCW Saturday Night or some TBS Superstation World Championship Wrestling, man. You see those bumps those guys were taking, man. It was unbelievable, man. You know what I mean? And, he was right there at the top of the chain taking, the big ones just like everybody else, so. But, so if you're new to the podcast, thank you guys so much for listening. Go support the Sit Down Marks podcast. If you're new to DB's Territory Treasures, I always end this or put somewhere close to the end a connection that I had with the wrestler that, or a person that I'm talking about, But George, he was a guy I noticed as a kid, right? So, you've heard me talk about my guys were the Boogie Woogie Man, you know what I mean? And Boogie Woogie would beat up George South, and I see George South get beat up by Flair, Steamboat, Barry Windham, Sam Houston, you know what I mean? And even more, and I remember asking my dad and be like, Dad, like, why does he always lose? You know what I mean? He loses to everybody. You know what I mean? Not just the good guys, not the bad guys. He loses to everybody. You know what I mean? I'm like, why? I'm like, all these guys are bigger than him. They're better than him, but he just keeps wrestling. He keeps showing up. I keep seeing him on my TV every Saturday night at 6:05, and I started to feel sorry for him after a while, a guy that was constantly getting beat up, of course, my dad didn't want to, ruin it at the time, but, it says just kind of like the old, life lesson, it's not how many times you get knocked down. It's how many times you can get back up, and he was kayfabing me, which is cool, which is fine. Like, I love it. I need to hear that, at the time, but I'm like, man, like how many times can you just keep getting beat? Like I went years, without seeing, I mean, I'm sure he started getting wins, later on or whatever, but yeah, it's kind of like, if you heard my Rocky King episodes, kind of the same thing with him. It's like, I start noticing, man, these guys are losing all the time, but George was in decent shape, not in great shape. He wasn't chiseled out of stone, that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? So I was probably a little more believable that he was getting beating in this versus somebody like Rocky King, who was just shredded, to the nines, I'd be like, oh, well, it's probably a little less believable as Rocky's getting beat like that all the time. He looks, just as good, if not better than the other guys sometimes. But, the things you recall, right? Growing up as a little wrestling fan, watching 605 Saturday night and thinking, Dad, why does that guy always get beat up? You know what I mean? So George got a book out. I think it's called Dad, You Don't Work, You Wrestle. Go look it up. Go look up a George South match. Go look George South matches in the 80s. Look up some old WCW. You'll see George South in there. But appreciate what he's done for the business. He came up through and, it was a pretty rough time. A lot of hard bumps and, guys weren't exactly treated the best then, but I'm glad he's still around, talk about it, be a great ambassador for the brand. Love George South, and just decided that he's still putting some work in out there. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is DB. I want to thank you guys so much for checking out the podcast today. I am DB. I drop these territory treasures usually about every other month. Check out my partner, Primo. His side project is called Cheap Pops with Primo. and also check out our flagship podcast. We got a lot going on here right now on the Sit Down Marks family of network, so to speak. We got Dreamwave Prelude. That is our side project as well. Going to be putting a lot more work into that coming up soon, so make sure you guys check that out at sitdownmarks.com. Go check out all my DB's Territory Treasures in the archives. I don't know, probably did about 7 or 8 of these now, I guess, something like that. But I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in. I appreciate it. Hope you guys having an awesome summer. Hope you guys are hanging out on the beach somewhere while you listening to this. But I want to thank you guys so much, man. I really do appreciate the love. Keep spreading the good word of wrestling out there, and we'll see you guys next time when I dive into another DB's Territory Treasures. Yeah.